On March 10th, 1957, a boy was born who would one day become one of the most infamous figures of the modern age, Osama bin Laden. His exact birthplace has long been debated. Some authorities insisted for years that it was the bustling port city of Jeddah, while others now believe it was the Saudi capital, Riyadh. But wherever his cradle stood, there was no dispute that Osama was born into wealth, power, and the shadow of a towering legacy. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, had come from humble beginnings in Yemen. As a young boy, Mohammed's family migrated north toward the Red Sea coast, a contested territory where the House of Saud and the crumbling Ottoman Empire once jostled for dominance. Through determination and shrewd connections, Mohammed rose from obscurity to become the favored construction magnate of Saudi Arabia's founding king, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. His company, the Saudi bin Laden Group, quickly blossomed into one of the most powerful firms in the kingdom. By the 1960s, it was managing the restoration of Islam's holiest mosques in Mecca and Medina, as well as the recladding of Jerusalem's Dome of the Rock, a portfolio that gave the bin Laden name unrivaled prestige and immense fortune. Osama's mother, Hamida al-Attas, was a Syrian teenager from a prosperous family of citrus farmers near Latakia. She was only 14 when she became Mohammed's 10th wife. He was nearly 50. Their union produced a single child, Osama, before ending in separation not long after. Some would later whisper that Hamida had been little more than a concubine. Regardless, Osama grew up in privilege, the son of a multimillionaire whose fortune would translate into billions today. After the separation, Hamida remarried Mohammed al-Attas, a business associate of her former husband. Osama was raised in their household, alongside 3 half-brothers and a half-sister. Although part of a blended family, he was never entirely cut off from his father's influence. Mohammed bin Laden remained a looming presence, shaping Osama's conservative religious outlook and sense of identity. Yet in 1967, tragedy struck. Mohammed died in a plane crash at the age of 59, leaving behind an empire and dozens of heirs. Osama, just 10 years old, inherited both wealth and a powerful name. Thus, the boy who would one day command global headlines began life at the crossroads of privilege, piety, and a dynasty whose ties reached deep into the heart of Saudi Arabia's monarchy. As Osama entered adolescence, the kingdom around him was transforming. Saudi Arabia's oil wealth was exploding, reshaping desert towns into glittering modern cities almost overnight. Yet amid the skyscrapers and sudden prosperity, a powerful undercurrent of religious conservatism defined everyday life. Osama, shy and slender, was shaped by both worlds: the privilege of a princely upbringing and the austerity of strict faith. In 1968, he began his formal education at the Al-Thagr Model School in Jeddah. The curriculum mixed modern subjects with heavy doses of Islamic instruction. To outsiders, Osama's youth seemed ordinary. He adored football, reportedly cheering for England's Arsenal club, and he devoured stories of military campaigns. But beneath these surface interests, his worldview was being quietly forged. He was deeply impressionable, and mentors within his family and community instilled in him a reverence for conservative Islam. By the early 1970s, Osama briefly glimpsed the wider world. In 1971, he traveled to Britain, enrolling in an English language course at Oxford. For the first time, he stood amid the universities and streets of the West. Accounts differ on how much this experience influenced him, but what is clear is that the exposure only deepened his sense that Western culture was decadent, materialistic, and dangerously detached from the spiritual rigor of Islam. At 17, while most teenagers were still navigating adolescence, Osama married his first wife, Najwa Ghanem, a cousin from his mother's side. It was 1974, and he was already settling into the family tradition of early and arranged marriages. Over the years, he would marry at least 4 more times, fathering more than 20 children. Yet even as he started a family, his path diverged sharply from the commercial empire he was expected to inherit. In 1976, at the age of 19, he enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. Officially, his studies focused on economics and business administration, preparing him for a role in the Bin Laden group. But Osama's heart was elsewhere. He immersed himself in religious study, poetry, and Arab literature. Friends from the time recalled that business hardly interested him. His mind was on faith, morality, and the destiny of the Islamic world. His inheritance, valued at more than $30 million, meant money was never a concern. Ideology was. The most profound influence of these years came through books and lectures. The writings of Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian thinker executed in 1966, resonated deeply with him. Qutb's vision of Islam at war with Western materialism, of jihad as a sacred duty, and of reviving a new caliphate struck Osama with almost prophetic force. At Abdulaziz University, Osama studied under Muhammad Qutb, Sayyid's brother, who carried the torch of these radical teachings. By the time Osama left the university in 1979, whether with a degree or not, he was already transformed. He was no longer merely a wealthy young Saudi with a famous name. He was a man gripped by an idea that Muslims everywhere must unite, resist foreign domination, and live under strict Sharia rule. This conviction would soon collide with history in the mountains of Afghanistan. In 1979, the world around Osama bin Laden convulsed with upheaval. To the east, Iran erupted in revolution, toppling the Shah and replacing him with the Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic. To the north, Afghanistan spiraled into chaos as a Marxist regime seized power, inviting the wrath of local insurgents and the wary gaze of the Soviet Union. By December of that year, Moscow launched a full-scale invasion, sending tanks and helicopters across the mountains in what would become its own Vietnam. For Osama, now in his early 20s, and freshly armed with a radical vision, history seemed to call. He left Saudi Arabia almost immediately after finishing his studies, traveling to Pakistan, the staging ground for thousands of foreign volunteers streaming in to join the Afghan jihad. There he fell under the wing of Abdullah Azam, a Palestinian cleric who preached that defending Muslim lands from atheistic invaders was a sacred obligation. For Osama, Azam was both mentor and catalyst, the man who transformed his fervent beliefs into militant action. At first, bin Laden's role was not that of a warrior, but of a facilitator. Using his inherited fortune, he bought supplies, funded training camps, and helped recruit fighters arriving from across the Arab world. He built networks that linked Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, ensuring that men and money flowed into the conflict. Yet even in these early years, he was more than just a financier. Osama walked the rugged trails of the Hindu Kush, lived alongside the Mujahideen, and gained their respect as a man willing to endure hardship in the mountains rather than watch the war from afar. In 1984, together with Azam, he founded Maktab al-Khidamat, the Services Bureau. Its mission was simple but far-reaching: to channel donations and volunteers from the Muslim world into the Afghan jihad. From mosques in Cairo to communities in New York, funds were raised, fighters were trained, and a generation of militants was forged under Osama's watchful eye. By 1986, he had established his own base inside Afghanistan, Al-Masada, the Lion's Den. From there, his men joined the fight directly, battling Soviet troops in the eastern mountains. A year later, Osama's reputation soared after the Battle of Jaji. Though strategically minor, the clash was immortalized in Arab media, with young journalist Jamal Khashoggi reporting on bin Laden's courage under fire. To many across the Muslim world, Osama bin Laden emerged not just as a wealthy patron, but as a warrior saint, a man of conviction, willing to shed blood for Islam. The Soviet war dragged on, devastating Afghanistan. By the late 1980s, with Western arms and Saudi money flooding in, the Mujahideen grew stronger. Moscow's might faltered, and for Osama bin Laden, hardened by the mountains and buoyed by fame, a new idea was beginning to take shape. The jihad should not end with Afghanistan. It should be global. By 1988, the war in Afghanistan was nearing its climax. The Soviet Union, bloodied and exhausted, was preparing to withdraw. For many foreign fighters, the mission was accomplished. Afghanistan had been defended and the Red Army humbled. But for Osama bin Laden, victory was not the end. It was the beginning. Within the networks, he and Abdullah Azam had built, through Maktab al-Khidamat, Osama saw the seeds of something larger. These men, trained and hardened by war, could not simply melt back into civilian life. They carried with them a vision of a unified Islamic struggle, and Osama was determined to give it a permanent home. Thus, in the twilight of the Afghan conflict, Al-Qaeda, the base, was born. Al-Qaeda was not just an organization, it was an idea. Its purpose was to extend jihad beyond Afghanistan to any corner of the Muslim world where foreign influence or apostate regimes held sway. Its goal was sweeping: to expel Western powers, overthrow secular governments, and ultimately re-establish a caliphate ruled by strict Sharia law. This vision marked a break from the more limited aims of Azam, who believed the focus should remain on Afghanistan. That ideological split would soon prove deadly. In 1989, Azam was assassinated in a car bombing in Peshawar. His death cleared the path for Osama's more radical agenda. Back in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden was welcomed as a hero. He was celebrated as the wealthy young aristocrat who had humbled the Soviets, the so-called Slayer of the Bear. But beneath the accolades, his worldview was hardening. He viewed the Western presence in the Middle East as a new form of colonialism, and he increasingly saw America not as an ally of convenience, but as the great enemy. The early 1990s became a turning point. The Gulf War erupted when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. For Osama, this was a crisis of faith. When U.S. troops poured into Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's holiest sites, he was incensed. He even offered King Fahd his own Arab fighters, veterans of Afghanistan, to defend the kingdom. The king refused, instead inviting the Americans. To Osama, this was betrayal. The guardians of Mecca and Medina had opened their doors to infidels. Publicly denouncing the royal family, he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In 1991, the Saudi government expelled him, cutting him off from his homeland and his inheritance. Osama bin Laden, once the golden son of Saudi privilege, was now in exile, free, at last, to build Al-Qaeda into the global vanguard of jihad. Banished from Saudi Arabia, in 1991, Osama bin Laden sought a new home for his growing movement. He found it in Sudan, a nation that had just undergone its own transformation. A military coup had brought Colonel Omar al-Bashir to power, and under the guidance of Islamist leader Hassan al-Turabi, Sudan was reshaping itself into a state governed by Sharia. For bin Laden, it was a natural refuge, a place where his money, his networks, and his fighters would be welcomed. Arriving in Khartoum in 1992, he wasted no time. He purchased vast tracts of land, built farms, invested in businesses, and established training camps on the outskirts of the capital. His compound became a fortress, guarded by heavily armed men. Sudan offered Osama the one thing he had lacked in Saudi Arabia: freedom to organize without constraint. From this base, Al-Qaeda expanded. Fighters from across the Muslim world cycled through its camps, learning the skills of war. Weapons were stockpiled, cash flowed in, and plans were drawn up. While he lived in relative comfort, Osama presented himself as a warrior scholar, a man who renounced worldly pleasure for the purity of jihad. The United States was watching. By the early 1990s, American intelligence was increasingly aware of bin Laden's activities. His fingerprints were suspected in a growing list of attacks. The 1992 bombing of a hotel in Aden, Yemen, targeting U.S. troops bound for Somalia, whispers of involvement in plots stretching from Egypt to East Africa. Then, in 1993, the World Trade Center in New York was rocked by a truck bomb. Though the evidence of his direct role was murky, the attackers were men shaped by Al-Qaeda's training grounds. Each act pulled bin Laden further into Washington's crosshairs. In 1996, U.S. sanctions against Sudan intensified, isolating the country diplomatically and economically. Within Sudan itself, the political winds shifted. President al-Bashir turned against Hassan al-Turabi, bin Laden's protector, leaving Osama exposed. Under growing pressure, Khartoum asked its guest to leave. That same year, bin Laden returned to Afghanistan, this time not as a volunteer among many, but as the undisputed leader of Al-Qaeda. The Taliban had just seized Kabul, offering him sanctuary in exchange for his money and loyalty. From the mountains once again, he issued a fiery declaration of war against the United States. Osama bin Laden was no longer just an exile. He was now the self-proclaimed commander of a global jihad, preparing to turn his fury directly against America. By 1996, Afghanistan was a shattered nation. Years of civil war had left the country in ruins until a new force swept across its mountains and deserts: the Taliban. Fiercely fundamentalist and militarily disciplined, the Taliban seized Kabul that year, promising to restore order under a strict interpretation of Islamic law. For Osama bin Laden, their rise was providence. Invited as a guest of Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban's reclusive leader, he found a sanctuary unlike any other, a land beyond the reach of Western powers, where he could rebuild his network and plot openly. It was here, from Afghan soil, that bin Laden escalated his war. In August 1996, he issued a declaration condemning the United States, accusing it of occupying the land of the two holy mosques in Saudi Arabia and serving as Israel's shield in the Middle East. His rhetoric sharpened in the years that followed. America, he claimed, was the root of Muslim suffering worldwide, supporting tyrants in the Arab world, punishing Iraq with devastating sanctions, backing Russia's brutal war in Chechnya, and oppressing Muslims in Kashmir and the Philippines. These words were not idle. They were a call to arms. Al-Qaeda began striking at U.S. targets abroad. In 1998, twin truck bombs tore through the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. More than 300 people were killed, thousands wounded. It was Al-Qaeda's bloodiest attack yet, and the world took notice. The FBI placed Osama bin Laden on its most wanted list, branding him a global menace. But he was not finished. Inside Al-Qaeda's Afghan camps, another, more audacious plan was taking shape. Conceived by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and approved by bin Laden in the late 1990s, it was unlike anything attempted before. Hijack commercial airplanes and use them as missiles against America itself. By 1999, 19 men had been selected, trained, and embedded inside the United States. Some learned to fly, others prepared for death. The targets were carefully chosen. The symbols of American might, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the halls of government in Washington. The date, too, carried symbolic weight. September 11th, echoing both 911, the American number for emergencies, and, perhaps, the historic defeat of the Ottoman Turks at Vienna in 1683. As dawn broke on September 11th, 2001, 4 planes lifted into the skies. Within hours, the world would change forever. The morning of September 11th, 2001, began like any other. Across the United States, millions went about their daily routines, commuting to work, boarding planes, grabbing coffee. But at airports in Boston, Washington, and Newark, 19 men quietly prepared to carry out Osama bin Laden's most devastating command. At 8:46 a.m., the world changed. American Airlines Flight 11, commandeered by 5 hijackers, slammed into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center. The explosion tore through the upper floors, sending plumes of fire and smoke into the clear blue sky. Confusion reigned. Was it an accident? A terrible malfunction? 17 minutes later, the answer came. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower with horrific force, exploding into a fireball witnessed by millions watching live television. The truth was undeniable. America was under attack. At 9:37 a.m., a third plane, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon, the heart of U.S. military power. Flames engulfed the Western Wall, killing soldiers and civilians alike. Meanwhile, the passengers of United Airlines Flight 93 fought back against their hijackers. The plane, believed to be aimed at the Capitol or the White House, never reached its target. Instead, it plummeted into a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m. Its passengers hailed forever as heroes. Back in New York, the Twin Towers burned. Inside, thousands struggled to escape, down stairwells choked with smoke, while those trapped above the impact zones faced a grim choice: perish in the flames or leap to their deaths. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed in a thunderous roar, sending a cloud of ash and debris cascading through lower Manhattan. 29 minutes later, the North Tower followed. In less than 2 hours, symbols of American might had been reduced to rubble. Nearly 3 hours' lives were lost. Workers, firefighters, police officers, airline passengers, and ordinary citizens from more than 90 countries. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in human history. The psychological impact was just as devastating. Images of the collapsing towers looped endlessly across television screens, seared into the global consciousness. America's sense of security was shattered. Osama bin Laden, watching from afar, had achieved what he long sought: a strike at the very heart of the United States, designed to provoke fear, chaos, and war. The world would never be the same. In the smoldering aftermath of September 11th, grief hardened into resolve. Just 1 week later, on September 18th, 2001, the United States Congress authorized the use of military force against those responsible. President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror, vowing to hunt down Osama bin Laden and dismantle Al-Qaeda wherever they hid. The trail led first to Afghanistan. The Taliban regime, which had sheltered bin Laden since 1996, refused to hand him over. On October 7th, 2001, U.S. and British forces launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Cruise missiles and fighter jets rained destruction on Taliban positions, while CIA teams and special forces joined the Northern Alliance on the ground. By November, Kabul had fallen. By December, the Taliban's last stronghold in Kandahar had collapsed. Yet the man most wanted by America remained elusive. Intelligence pointed to a sprawling cave complex in eastern Afghanistan known as Tora Bora. In December 2001, U.S. and Afghan fighters mounted an assault. For nearly 2 weeks, bombs shook the mountains as Al-Qaeda fighters resisted fiercely. American officials later concluded that Osama bin Laden was there, perhaps even cornered. But the force on the ground was too small, relying heavily on Afghan militias, whose loyalties were uncertain. Somewhere amid the smoke and chaos, bin Laden slipped away. By early 2002, he had vanished across the border into Pakistan. From that moment, he became a phantom. Washington raised the bounty on his head to $25 million, later doubled to $50 million, and his face appeared on most wanted posters across the globe. But despite satellites, drones, and informants, he evaded capture. Rumors placed him in the tribal areas of Waziristan, or hiding in the caves of Baluchistan. Some even claimed he had fled to Iran. The truth remained hidden. Meanwhile, the U.S. poured its might into 2 wars, Afghanistan and, soon after, Iraq. Bin Laden, from the shadows, continued to issue tapes and declarations, urging Muslims to strike American soldiers and Western allies wherever they could be found. Al-Qaeda bombings shook Bali, Madrid, London, Baghdad, and beyond. Each attack carried his signature: asymmetrical terror, designed to sow fear far greater than the size of the operation itself. Though his body was absent, his presence loomed everywhere. Osama bin Laden was no longer just a fugitive. He was a symbol, a specter haunting America's wars, a reminder that the fight was far from over. For nearly a decade after Tora Bora, Osama bin Laden became the world's most wanted man and its greatest enigma. The CIA hunted him across Pakistan's rugged frontier, pouring billions into surveillance, informants, and covert missions. Yet he vanished like a ghost, his trail reduced to whispers and speculation. In truth, bin Laden had not disappeared into caves at all. By 2005, he was living in an unlikely place. Abbottabad, a quiet Pakistani garrison town, less than a 2-hour drive from Islamabad, the nation's capital. On a 38 square foot compound built behind high concrete walls topped with barbed wire, he carved out a life of seclusion. The house had no internet or phone lines, few windows, and an upper balcony shielded by tall privacy screens. Inside, bin Laden lived with multiple wives, children, and loyal guards. From this unlikely sanctuary, just down the road from Pakistan's elite military academy, he managed his fading network, scribbling messages on paper that were hand-carried by trusted couriers. The compound's very strangeness became its undoing. By 2009, U.S. intelligence had tracked one of bin Laden's closest couriers, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, to Abbottabad. Months of surveillance followed. Drones circled above, operatives on the ground watched patterns of life, and analysts built a case. Though no photographs confirmed it, the evidence grew compelling. A tall man who never left the compound, a house built like a fortress, the presence of trusted aides. By early 2011, the CIA was convinced. President Barack Obama faced a choice fraught with risk. A bombing raid might obliterate the compound, but also leave only dust and doubt. A ground assault could confirm bin Laden's death, but risk catastrophe if it failed. After weeks of tense deliberation, Obama gave the order. The operation was codenamed Neptune Spear. On the night of May 1st, 2011, 2 stealth helicopters lifted from a base in Afghanistan carrying a team of U.S. Navy SEALs. Under cover of darkness, they slipped across the border into Pakistan. 40 minutes later, they descended into Abbottabad. The hunt for Osama bin Laden was about to end, not in the desolate mountains where he had once been king, but behind the high walls of a house in a sleepy Pakistani town. It was shortly after midnight on May 2nd, 2011, in Pakistan, when the stillness of Abbottabad was shattered. 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters swept low over the walls of Osama bin Laden's compound. Inside one of them were members of SEAL Team 6, America's most elite commandos. Their mission was clear: find and kill the man responsible for September 11th. As the helicopters descended, one faltered, its tail rotor clipping the compound wall. The craft crash-landed inside the courtyard, but the SEALs poured out, uninjured and undeterred. Gunfire erupted. Bin Laden's couriers, including Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, opened fire and were cut down. The SEALs moved swiftly, clearing each floor with precision, their night vision goggles slicing through the darkness. Back in Washington, President Obama and his top advisors watched events unfold in real time from the White House Situation Room. For them, the tension was unbearable. Minutes stretched into hours. On the 3rd floor, the SEALs found him. Osama bin Laden stood in the doorway of his bedroom, a towering figure at 6'4". In the chaos of shouts and gunfire, he was shot, once in the chest, once above the left eye. The architect of the deadliest terrorist attack in history crumpled to the floor, lifeless, The SEALs secured the compound, gathering hard drives, documents, and other intelligence. In one room, they found bin Laden's family, wives and children huddled in fear. Within 40 minutes of landing, the operation was complete. Laden with evidence and carrying the most valuable body in the world, the SEALs boarded their remaining helicopter and vanished into the night. Hours later, DNA tests confirmed what the world would soon learn. Osama bin Laden was dead at 11:35 p.m. On May 1st, 2011, President Obama addressed the nation. Justice has been done. Across America, crowds gathered in the streets, waving flags, chanting, and singing. Nearly a decade after 9/11, the man who had haunted the world was gone. Bin Laden's body never found a grave, following Islamic tradition of burial within 24 hours, but determined to deny extremists a shrine. U.S. forces took his remains to the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson. There, weighted with iron, the corpse was lowered into the Arabian Sea. The hunt was over. The specter of Osama bin Laden had been erased in a single night of violence and secrecy. The death of Osama bin Laden marked the end of a man, but not the end of the war he had set in motion. In Washington, his killing was hailed as a triumph, the long-delayed justice for September 11th. Yet even as crowds celebrated, intelligence officials warned, Al-Qaeda lived on. Within hours of the raid, analysts pored over the hard drives, notebooks, and flash drives taken from Abbottabad. They revealed a leader still deeply involved, writing instructions to his lieutenants, lamenting Al-Qaeda's fading influence, and plotting new attacks. But bin Laden's death dealt the group a psychological blow it would never fully recover from. His successor, the Egyptian ideologue Ayman al-Zawahiri, lacked his charisma and mythic aura. Al-Qaeda fragmented, its affiliates in Yemen, North Africa, and the Sahel acting with increasing independence. Then came a rival, far more brutal, far more shocking. Out of the chaos of post-invasion Iraq, a Jordanian militant named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had forged Al-Qaeda in Iraq. After his death, the group evolved, rebranding itself as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS. In 2014, under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ISIS declared a caliphate across vast swathes of Iraq and Syria. Their black flags, beheadings, and genocidal violence eclipsed even Al-Qaeda in notoriety. By the mid-2010s, the epicenter of jihad had shifted. Al-Qaeda was viewed by some extremists as too moderate, a startling irony. ISIS commanded global headlines, attracting tens of thousands of recruits from around the world. The wars in Iraq and Syria fueled a refugee crisis. Terror attacks struck Paris, Brussels, and beyond, and the Middle East once again burned. Yet over time, ISIS too crumbled under relentless military pressure. By 2017, its territorial caliphate had been dismantled. Al-Qaeda, battered but not destroyed, lingered on in the shadows, its influence stretching across Africa and South Asia. Meanwhile, the United States faced the endless cost of bin Laden's legacy. 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, trillions spent, hundreds of thousands dead. In 2021, American troops withdrew from Afghanistan, and the Taliban, bin Laden's old hosts, returned to power. Osama bin Laden had been dead for a decade, but his shadow remained. His life, from privileged son of a billionaire to fugitive slain in the night, had redrawn the map of global security, reshaped the Middle East, and scarred the 21st century. Justice had been done, but the world he left behind still bore his mark. Osama bin Laden's story is one of contradictions. He was born into unimaginable wealth, yet chose a life of asceticism and war. He was soft-spoken in private, but thunderous in his denunciations of the West. To some, he was a martyr. To many more, he was the face of evil. Above all, he was a man who harnessed the grievances of the Muslim world and weaponized them into a global ideology of terror. His legacy is written in fire and ash, the Twin Towers collapsing into clouds of dust, the embassies in East Africa reduced to rubble, the charred walls of the Pentagon, from New York to Baghdad, from Kabul to Paris. His name became synonymous with death and fear. But bin Laden did not act in isolation. He was a product of his time, shaped by the Cold War, empowered by petrodollars, radicalized by ideology, and sustained by failed states that offered him shelter. His death in Abbottabad in 2011 was meant to close a chapter, and in some ways, it did. Al-Qaeda, robbed of its founding leader, never regained its former strength. But the forces he unleashed proved harder to kill. ISIS rose from the ruins of Iraq, spreading brutality across the Middle East. Other extremist groups flourished in the Sahel, in Yemen, in Somalia. Each carried a fragment of his vision, even as they fought under different names and flags. Yet history also records the limits of his ambition. Bin Laden dreamed of a revived caliphate, a unified Muslim world, rising against the West. Instead, his violence often claimed the lives of Muslims themselves, leaving cities in ruins and communities shattered. Over time, the majority of the Muslim world turned away from his message, weary of endless bloodshed. Today, the world he changed still grapples with the aftermath. Airports remain fortresses, intelligence agencies ever vigilant, and the memory of September 11th lingers like an open wound. Entire generations grew up in the shadow of that day. Osama bin Laden did not live to see the collapse of ISIS or the shifting alliances in the Middle East. He did not witness the Arab Spring or the slow re-emergence of peace in places he once sought to inflame. But the question he leaves behind endures. How could one man, born into privilege in Riyadh, alter the course of history so violently? His life is a cautionary tale of how ideas, money, and opportunity can converge to unleash chaos. His death ended his story, but the shadow of Osama bin Laden still stretches across the 21st century.